for a lot of men is detrimental, because one of the reasons why men don't really open up is they figure if they get busy enough, they don't have to process it. But unfortunately with grief, the common sentiment is the only way to get through grief is to grieve. I mean, there's no alternate route. You have to go through it. You have to experience whatever the tough moments are for you.
Welcome to This Way Up, the podcast dedicated to supporting parents and caregivers navigating the complex world of mental health. I'm Andrea, and each episode we dive deep into the conversations that matter, exploring the challenges, triumphs, and transformative journeys of those facing mental health struggles within their families. Whether you're here for expert advice, inspiring stories, or just a little boost to get you through the day, we've got you covered. So grab a cup of coffee, kick back, and join us as we find the bright spots in the mental health journey, because we're all climbing our way up together. We are joined today with Jason Tuttle, who is a former stay-at-home parent and married father of 2 kids with multiple physical and cognitive disabilities. He lost his 15-year-old son, sadly, on January of 2022. From that day, Jason decided that he wanted to help others while he grieved. So he created an online group called To Zachary as an open, raw, vulnerable way to be an example and share his feelings, as well as help others to see a glimpse into the male mind and how it grieves. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, and I know that this is a very tender space for you, so we appreciate your vulnerability and you seeing how important it is to share that with other people out there.
Certainly. In the grand scheme of things, the short amount of time I've done this and the response I've gotten, there seems to be a huge need.
There really is. I think grief is one of those places, I think culturally for women, it's probably a little more acceptable to show the emotions and to process grief. But for men, I still don't think we're there yet. And it's amazing that you're coming out bravely to talk about this.
Well, my wife would tell you that I've never been the norm as it is. I've always kind of bucked the trends, if you will. I personally believe, as it relates to grief and a lot of other issues, that people need to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, we see what we see on TV and the news and just what society portrays of it, but that's just a short glimpse into what actually grief is. And for those that have never experienced loss, yeah, we get the typical responses that people know that are kind of the right things to say, because they just don't know how to come up and talk to someone who's lost someone. And yes, it's that, but it's honestly so much more than that.
Yeah, I would imagine. And I think it's hard for both people, right? It's hard for the person that's grieving, and it's hard for the person that's trying to comfort those who are grieving, because nobody really has experience in that, right?
One of the reasons why a lot of people have a hard time dealing with grief is because a lot of people get the sugar-coated version of it.
Yeah.
And I didn't say it when we were initially recording, but like when I first posted that first post, like I put a disclaimer to it. I said, this is going to be raw, in the moment, how I'm feeling. If I felt like that I needed to write an F-bomb into because that's how I was feeling in the moment, that's what I wrote. If I felt like I wanted to write about some of the dark thoughts I was having as it relates to losing my son and not being able to save him and all that kind of thing, that's what I wrote about. And, if grief sucks, I want them to tell me, yeah, grief sucks. It's going to knock you down. It's going to be hard. You're going to have days where you don't want to get out of bed. You don't want to talk to people. You don't want to deal with anybody. You want to be in a ball in the corner. Yeah, all those days are going to come, but all of those days are natural.
Right.
All of those days they're completely under the umbrella of what grief is, especially that first 6 months to a year. When people ask me what grief is like, I look at them and say, the best analogy I can give you is, imagine you're riding a train, you're going through the Rocky Mountains, and all of a sudden you come upon a tunnel. And you're in the center of the tunnel. It's pitch black. You can't see anything. In the moment that you lose your child, you're in that pitch black. You don't know where to go. You're lost. You're trying to find your way around. You're bumping into everything on the inside of that train. It knocks you over at times, that kind of thing. You continually do that. But eventually, after enough time with you slowly moving forward, you'll start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and you'll start to, a little more clarity will come and a little more clarity come until you can get to a point where you can move forward. Now, you get through that tunnel, but unfortunately in grief, you get through that tunnel and you can see several miles down the track on your grief journey, but you also see several more tunnels on that very same track. So where you may get into light for a short period and have a lesser moment, more trials they're coming. Now, in the beginning of that grief journey, the tunnels are close together, but the farther along you get on that grief journey, the farther spaced out those blacked out tunnels are. So in the beginning for me, those tunnels, when I left one tunnel, I immediately went into another tunnel. But now at 2.5 years out, I've gotten out of a tunnel and the next tunnel may be a mile down the track. When someone that has not dealt with grief, and I dealt with this and many people in the community have, it forces them to look at something that they don't want to talk about. It forces them to look at mortality, which I know is a difficult topic. And 99% of us, until we're forced to deal with it, why would we want to deal with it? None of us get out of this life alive. At some point, you're going to have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And in my son's case, and even my daughter's, I was always under the mindset, I'm going to prepare for the worst, expect the best, and then I'm not surprised. My son had chronic illnesses. Did I think he was going to pass early? No, I didn't. Did I always know it was a possibility because of his issues? 100% I knew it was there.
I don't know that many of us can relate to that, actually. I don't even know how to respond to that, really, because it's probably the healthy way to look at things is that you have to prepare yourself, but it's certainly not the way that you want to, right?
No, probably the biggest thing that kind of threw me for a loop, if you will, is the way he passed was sudden and unexpected. That was probably the biggest punch. Yeah, he had a lot of chronic illnesses and all that. And even the official cause to why he passed away was the symptoms that I saw that morning while he was still alive was nothing I had dealt with before. Nothing. I'd never seen them before, didn't know what they were. I just knew that they were different. And it was honestly just a hunch as to why I brought him to the hospital. Well, I mean, we were just, as any parent, we were just stunned as what had happened.
Sure.
He woke up at 8:30 that morning. By I think it's 10:34, he was pronounced. So 2 hours that morning, it took him from start to finish that all that happened. And then, you get into all the funeral process, and, it's what they say, you have the worst day of your life and you have to make 1,000 decisions.
I just, words can't express. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine. How did you get through all of that?
I've always been naturally ornery or stubborn. I come from a long line of people that are ornery and stubborn. Like with my son, I just had a regiment that I had to go through on a normal day, let alone those moments where things happened and I would have to make split-second decisions and essentially throw him in the van and drive him up to the hospital. I'd throw him in the van and I'd get on the interstate and I'd be doing 90 to 100 down to the children's hospital to get him to the hospital. I guess there's this drive that I've got, if you will, just pushes me it's in every area of my life. My wife will tell you that if I get my brain going on something, I will not stop until it's done. Even if it means when I stop, I drop, I will do it.
Right. I wonder if you were able to process some of your emotions through responsibilities. You know how some people do things, they get busy and that's how they manage their stress and they're busy. And other people, stop.
They do. And that's a common sentiment in the grief world that for a lot of men is detrimental, because one of the reasons why men don't really open up is they figure if they get busy enough, they don't have to process it. But unfortunately with grief, the common sentiment is the only way to get through grief is to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no alternate route. You have to go through it. You have to experience whatever the tough moments are for you.
Well, that's true. That's true. And, for our listeners, there's the grief of losing someone, and then there's the grief of losing the person that you thought you had. And I'm sure you experienced that too when your children were born with multiple disabilities. You have this picture in your mind of what your life is going to be like. And then it changes and you learn to love that child unconditionally, but there's a grief process there as well. So I think that grief can face us many times during our life.
Certainly. There was certainly a huge learning curve when it came to, what any parent thinks their life is going to be like. You marry your significant other, you decide that you want to have a family, and my wife got pregnant. And honestly, for the start of our story was we had no reason to believe there were any issues for generations in my family. So when we got to the week 20 appointment, which is the appointment that you find out the sex of the child, the ultrasound tech literally looked at us and said, I need to know the sex of your child because I found an issue. At that point, we were just like, we want to know the sex. What's the issue?
Right.
And so she said, well, you're having a boy. As for what the issues, that's kind of a doctor relayed message. And so I looked at her and said, well, if you can't say that, why do you need to know the sex of the child? And so she comes back and goes, well, if it's what I think it is, it's rare in boys, but even rarer in girls. And so I needed to know the sex of the child to kind of let the doctor know, here's what's going on. Here's the sex of the child. Here you go. And so from that point, from week 20 on through my son's entire life and continuing on with my daughter's life, it's just been one kind of hurdle after the other.
Wow, that's a lot as a parent. Tell us a little bit about what your son Zachary had so that we understand that.
Okay. Well, the easy things to understand that everybody recognizes is my son was born with severe neurological delays, which means when he passed away at 15, he was actually functioning at 4 to 6 years old.
Okay.
He was born with epilepsy. He had 2 different kinds of seizures that he had. We ultimately kept in check with medication. He was nonverbal. He did say a few words here and there, but for the most part, he didn't talk. Now, you could ask him a yes, no question, and he would like make a sound like he was saying yes.
Okay.
But to say the word yes, no. He said mama once, never said dad, his entire life. And that was, for me as a man, that was a little bit of grieving for me as well. Just because if he ever said anything, I wanted him just to at least hear it once, and I never did.
I can imagine.
I mean, at this point, it is what it is. But, that was a little difficult for me. So he had the delays. He had epilepsy. He was nonverbal. He could walk with assistance, like me holding him up under his arms, but to walk on his own, no. He was basically in a wheelchair. Now, he could army crawl like crazy on the floor, but like to stand up and walk, no. We personally believe some of his neurological issues were what was affecting his ability to learn to walk, is what we believed. Can't say we confirmed it, but it was just a gut feeling that we had. So the neurological delays, the epilepsy, the nonverbal, and the wheelchair bound, my daughter was born with all of those identical issues. She was born literally 2 years apart, almost to the day. And she was born with all of those issues identical.
And you didn't see anything in your family history?
No.
Wow.
The irony of all of this was my father was going through Ancestry.com during the time, and he literally went back 10 generations, and there's nothing that's not self-induced, like an alcoholism or something like that. But the other thing you've got to remember with like Ancestry.com, it wasn't up until probably about the 60s, maybe 70s, where it was okay to list, well, I have a son or daughter with epilepsy or cerebral palsy or Down syndrome or one of those things. So even though we're 2024 at this point, it's only been within about the last 50 plus years where it's been acceptable. So there could have been something that we don't know about. And even on my wife's side, they went back 5 generations and there was nothing. And my wife and I had 2 kids born 2 years almost to the day with identical issues. Now, my son was born with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome. It's more affectionately known as prune belly syndrome. Eagle-Barrett syndrome unto itself, there's kind of some big characteristics to it. There's a lot of little secondary things, but basically what happens is my son was born without any abdominal muscle, none. So like you could lay him on the floor and the only thing between his midsection organs and the outside world were skin and the fascia that held it together. That was it. Like I could lay him on the floor and I could take my pointer finger and literally touch his large intestine, his small intestine, his stomach, his like all of his organs. I could point them out to you.
Wow.
From there. So that's the main characteristic. And then he had an abnormally large bladder that didn't want to drain on its own, at least the first 5 years of his life. So I had to give him a catheter every 4 hours to drain his bladder. So the kidney issue, the stomach issue, the bladder issue were all related to it. He had a normal lung capacity, but he couldn't take that deep breath. So, for example, when you or I would get a pneumonia style like illness, because we have our core abdominal muscles, we've almost got that like cement floor that we can build pressure on to build that cough up, to get with force, cough stuff out. Well, he couldn't do that. So at a certain point in his life, I had 6 respiratory machines in his room. So the moment I heard that specific cough, I would immediately start through my protocol. If I start with this machine, then I go here, and I get through all that. And then I eventually get to like a nebulizer, which most parents know what that is, and give them a breathing treatment. And I hope that I get ahead of it. If I don't, then ultimately I'm taking him to the hospital and he's getting admitted that night. And we're staying 6 to 10 days every time this happens. And for the first 6 years of his life, we were in and out of the hospital, the ICU specifically, once every 6 months.
Wow. That's a lot on anybody. But then on top of it, you also had your daughter that required special attention, maybe not as intricate as that, but certainly more than your traditional child.
2 things I'll say about that is, one, you'd be amazed the pushback that we got saying that we were going to want to have another child after having our son, and all this came out. We always knew we wanted to have a second child. Plus all the research I had done, everything said there's no guarantee that you're going to have another child with all these issues.
Sure.
None.
Yeah.
The percentage of that happened was so minuscule. I honestly probably should have played the lottery after it happened.
Yeah.
And honestly, even after my daughter was born, for the first 6 months, she was the normal one of the 2 of them. But when issues started coming out, it was the pediatrician that said, if you're basing your daughter's development on your son, she's going to look normal. But in reality, she's delayed. And from that point forward, that's when the snowball started rolling for her. And we started finding about seizures and delays and nonverbal and that kind of thing.
Wow. That is a lot. That's a lot of stress on a parent and on a person. Were you able to do any self-care or anything for yourself during this time? How did you cope with all of that?
Honestly, this kind of goes to the primal roots of just being a man. A lot of it I compartmentalized. I kind of pushed away. It was one of those, yeah, I've got to deal with it, but I've got more pressing issues because my son's got issues. I've got to take care of my daughter. I've got to make sure, because my wife at that point was the breadwinner. So my goal of being a home was making sure she was well taken care of enough so that she could perform her job well enough to not worry while she was at work of what was going on.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was a lot of compartmentalization. And, the term that I've coined for years over it has been, this is just another day I've got to kind of muscle through it. I mean, I don't have any other choice. My kids need their care. With my son, there were times in the blink of an eye, I had to make split-second decisions. And even before my son passed away, there were a couple of times I had to do things to save his life. It was just one of those, I was always in go mode. From the day we found out after my son was born of all of his issues, to this day, I still have sleeping issues. I don't think I've slept well through the night much in 20 years.
How could you? How could you, really? I mean, you're always on alert. Now, I'm going to fast forward because you had said that you were with him when he passed. And I think that is a blessing. As sad as it probably was, it was a blessing. How did you as a family move through that whole process?
For anybody, it would be difficult. at least for the day of, because I was in the ER room while they were working on him until they pronounced him. I can remember everything in vivid detail down to the most minute thing. One, because it's my son, and two, that's just how my brain works. But, for me, there was a lot of compartmentalization again, because I needed to know answers. Like in that moment, I needed to know what they were going to do at that point, what the next steps were, who I needed to call for like a funeral home, how am I going to get my son home? And then, when we got home, it was kind of talking to the funeral home. What are those next steps? So for a couple of days there, I was hyper focused on getting him from the hospital to the funeral home into what we're going to do, to the services, that kind of thing. Between my wife and I'm the more outwardly spoken when it comes to emotion. At home, did I break down and have moments where I was like it punched me in the gut? Yes. Would I do that out in public? No. It was more of a home thing. My wife's a little more quiet and unto herself, and she has her moments, and neither way is bad. It's just different.
Right.
And so I had many moments. I was sitting on our couch on my laptop. I'd watch a Facebook reel that had something related to like my son, and it would just hit me like a Mack truck, and I would just be bawling.
Sure.
Because it was so recent to everything that had happened. My wife just wasn't necessarily that way. And that happened for at least the first 9 months to a year, maybe a little bit farther. But we talked with each other, and, we confided in each other. And I mean, that's kind of how we got through it. And I mean, we are strong in our faith, in our belief system. In fact, my son passed away on a Friday. We were in church that Sunday. In fact, one of the associate pastors who normally walks around and greets everybody before the service starts, he literally looks at us and went, "Why are y'all here?" And I said, "You're a pastor is teaching faith. We're faithful. Where else would we be?"
Yeah.
And he just kind of looked at me, and you could see the light bulb click in his head. And he was just like, "Well, that's a good point." And I said, "Yes, it's tough, but we would rather be here."
Now, how did your daughter do with it? How was she able to process things?
She did in her own way.
She did.
The day that it happened, she got sent to school. So when we came home that afternoon, she had no idea. And so she comes home, and my daughter always knew that when I took her brother to the hospital, which she called Bubba because that was the name she could pronounce.
Mm-hmm.
When I took her Bubba to the hospital, she knew that I left with him, I stayed with him, I came home with him. And so when she saw me and her mother here and our son not with us, you could see the wheels turn, like, where's Bubba? I don't see Bubba. What's going on? And so I had to figure out a way to dumb it down, if you will, to explain in this most simplest concept of why her brother wasn't there. And for the longest time, I felt like she blamed me. And I mean, I don't take offense to that. She didn't know any better.
Right.
She just knew one thing, and that one thing wasn't happening. And probably 6 months there, I thought she was angry with me. Like, how could you not bring my brother home? And I told her repeated times, girl, if daddy could have brought your brother home, I would have much rather brought your brother home.
Right. Right.
And she would have moments here and there where she would just out of the blue just start bawling. Was that grief? We don't know. We associated it with it because she never used to do that before.
Okay.
And so we associated with grief. Now, one of the things that we did is we bought a like stuffed pillow animal that had like a Superman figure on the bottom with a superimposed head of my son on it. And so she holds on to that all the time.
Oh, that's precious, actually. That's really precious. So to help with the grieving, you started letters was it letters for Zachary?
Letters to Zachary.
To Zachary, excuse me. Letters to Zachary. Tell me how you came up with that and what kind of precipitated all of that.
Well, I've always been a proponent of therapy. I believe that we all have seasons where we may need assistance in just life and social things. And
you are unusual for a man. Just kidding. But yeah. Most men do not believe in therapy.
Several sessions after my son had passed away, she goes, "Have you ever thought about journaling?" And my ironic answer was, "Yeah, I don't know if writing is my thing. I don't know if that's something I want to do." Mm-hmm. And she goes, "Well, keep it on the shelf. You can come back to it later. It's kind of a mindfulness activity. You can get it out, and whether you share it or not, she said, at least you're getting it out. And she said you could delete it or burn it in a fire or something like that. And I said, okay. And so for probably 9 months after the fact, it sat on my side table. And then just one day I was having a really rough day, and I opened up a Word document, and just in true English form letter, a date, name, dear Zachary, that kind of thing. I just started writing my just raw, guttural feelings of what I was going through in the moment. And I wrote those for days and days and days. And one day I found a group on Facebook, because, you can find a group for everything on Facebook.
Yeah. Yep.
And there was a woman that was the moderate admin of the group, and I got to know her really well. And I said, do you mind if I post a journal entry? And she, like probably most women, went, oh, yes, we'd love to have it. We so rarely get those. And, in the moment right before I posted, I thought, I have to mentally prepare myself. I'm either going to get a good response, or I could possibly get a negative response. And I have to be mentally prepared for that in the mental state I'm currently in. And so in my fashion, I just kind of went, screw it. I'm going to post it anyways. Let's see what happens. And so I did. And I almost immediately got a massive response in this group. Positive, but a massive response. I had so many women in this group go, we don't know each other. I have never told anybody what like kind of the deepest, darkest feelings I've been feeling. And you have hit the nail on the head, word for word. She said, it's like you have read my mind. And I said, well, I appreciate it. And I said, it's inspired by my son, and I'm glad it resonates with you. I said, I'm just one of those. I believe people need to see the ugly side of grief. I'm very pro that. And so I kept doing those over the next several months. And every time I was getting these responses, finally someone said, have you ever thought about doing like a Facebook page? And then you can just copy and paste what you're writing. And then you're not necessarily creating more. You're just kind of moving it over.
Well, I think the more we speak about it and the more we talk about how important emotions are for humans in general, I think that's what it is emotions are part of the human experience. Sadness and grief and joy and anger and jealousy, all of those are things that sit within all of us and need to be acceptable to be expressed and worked through in all of us. So I thank you so much for sharing that very tender space. And I'm so sorry for your loss of Zachary. I can't fathom, but we appreciate you sharing everything.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to This Way Up. I hope you're feeling a little lighter, a little brighter, and ready to take on whatever comes next. Remember, the journey of mental health is all about progress, not perfection. So keep climbing. And don't forget to celebrate the small wins. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could use a little lift.